A bipartisan group of senators is still negotiating the details of an infrastructure bill after a procedural vote to start debate failed yesterday. They say they're making progress and hope to have the details by early next week. The biggest sticking point in negotiations remains how to pay for it. The $1.2 trillion framework includes about $600 billion in new spending. That money would go toward public projects like shoring up roads and bridges, expanding broadband, and investing in electric vehicles. Democrats are also planning a separate $3.5 trillion spending bill. For more on where infrastructure stands, I'm joined by Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. She led a separate bipartisan effort on infrastructure last month. And Senator, welcome back to the NewsHour. We appreciate your joining us. So we know you're not part of this group that's negotiating the current plan, but is it your sense that there will be an agreement in coming days that both parties can sign on to?
You know, I think that the efforts that the bipartisan group has put forward has been very straightforward and very honest, very narrow in terms of a physical infrastructure, much like the package that I was negotiating with more dollars into it. I do expect that early next week, hopefully as soon as Monday, that they will have actual bill text so we would know what we would be voting on. It may take a couple days to work it through the system and maybe even another week. But I do think that they are going to be able to lay the last issues to rest and bring forward a bill, and then we can make the judgments on it when we see it.
And of course, we'll be watching very closely for that. But this has been, as you suggest, in the works for weeks and weeks, even months. It is taking a long time. Much of the hang-up has been over how to pay for it. Democrats say that Republicans have repeatedly said no to ideas like putting more money into the IRS to go after tax cheats. And what's reported right now is that Republicans are looking at something called rolling pharmaceutical rebates. But we know this would only pay for a fraction of the cost. So where would the money come from?
Well, we have to look at it. Certainly the base of what goes forward and paying for any kind of infrastructure is the gas tax. But we know that falls short in terms of meeting the demands of where we are. So I think that this group has worked, as I did, has worked with the White House to try to get the White House to reprogram some COVID dollars, a lot of COVID dollars that are either going unspent or are found that they really, since we're coming out of this pandemic, are not going to be able to use in the right times. That may, it sounds like a little, but it's really hundreds of billions of dollars. We as Republicans did not want to touch the 2017 tax cuts because we think they've been very successful in spurring the economy. The president himself did not want to ask users of electric vehicles to pay into any kind of user fee. They use the roads, they don't pay. So we had a bit of a disconnect there. I think both sides are trying to get to reasonable pay-fors, but I expect in the end it's going to be tough to meet all the challenges of the pay for. I guess the question will be, is enough of it paid for, and will the economic growth take care of the shortfall? And people are going to have to answer that for themselves.
Why have Republicans mainly opposed the idea of giving the IRS more money to go after tax cheats?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because the overhang of some IRS issues that we had with the IRS targeting conservative groups, I think we saw tax returns from the wealthiest individuals just all of a sudden, public information. Where did that come from? That has to be some sort of a leak. So I think these things feed on each other, and the trust of the IRS coming knocking at your door. The other thing is the parameters of which the Democrats set forward in terms of getting to the president told me $700 billion. I think he came off that figure, but would be that banks would share records, would be that your accountant would share records. Are we getting into a fine line of where we need to really invasion of privacy and privacy of financial records? These issues, I think, are very sensitive to us as Republicans, and I think in the end, the group knew that we wouldn't, to the amounts that they wanted, we couldn't go with the tax gap. So I expect that to be in their larger bill, in their $3.5 trillion larger bill.
Senator, you've expressed concern also about this infrastructure legislation being tied to this separate $3.5 trillion
Right.
so-called reconciliation bill, what the Democrats are calling social infrastructure. But it is being described, Democrats are saying this is the most consequential piece of legislation for working families in modern American history. They talk about the money in there for home health care workers, for pre-K, for child care, for the poor, elderly. Why are these things not worth spending money on?
Well, we do now spend money on these things. I think, I think these are discussions that we need to work through our committees. Do we need to increase? I believe home health care is something, after having my parents go through this, I realized the tremendous cost of families. These are issues that we need to work on together. We don't need to ram through. What I disagree with where the Democrats are going, they've set an amount. They've said, okay, we're going to spend $3.5 trillion, and then they're filling up the buckets. Shouldn't we be looking at the needs and then look at what the cost is? And so I think if we're going to make consequential, huge social reform all across this country, we should be doing that together. And it won't be that. It'll be singularly done. This was a huge tax increase on the American public, and it's also a lot of reckless spending going along with it.
But when you say there's already money, that the country, that the government is already spending money on these things like home health care, we hear from Democrats that's just not the case, that much, much more needs to be done.
I'm not saying that we're spending as much as we need to, or that we're meeting the need. That's what I'm saying. Let's define the need. How much more do we need to spend? What will keep a senior in their home longer to be able to have home health care and not make a greater cost to Medicaid or to the family? These are the kinds of discussions we need to have.
Different subject quickly, Senator, and that is the federal government debt ceiling. The amount of money the government has to pay for its bills to keep running. This has typically been not a popular thing, but a necessary and a routine thing in order to keep the government open. However, the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is saying right now that all Republicans will vote against raising it. We know you voted for it. We looked it up 3 times under President Trump. Why would now be different?
Well, I think, I'll tell you what, the debt ceiling vote is always a difficult vote, and it's always has some source of controversy through the years, and I'm sure you know that, having covered it probably dozens of times. And I think what we need to look at is we've spent $1.9 trillion on a rescue package that we now see our communities flooded with money, and some of the money cannot be unspent, for instance, in the unemployment area, because governors have pulled back on that. I think we see now a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package coming down the road. We now see a $3.5 trillion package coming down the road after that. I think at some point we've got to look at what impacts this is having on our whole finances in this country. The debt ceiling, in all likelihood, will be raised. It has every time in the past. We're not going to default on our responsibilities. But I think we need to look at the spending and find out who's it costing individuals and what's this do to future generations. That's the discussion we need to have.
Does it matter to you that the chief economist at Moody's, Mark Zandi, is saying that passing these 2 infrastructure bills, both social infrastructure and the other one, are going to boost the economy and reduce all the concerns about inflation? In other words, that the concern that there's too much spending is overdone.
Well, I think, I've been here for 20 years. We used to talk in billions. It's now trillions. Remember in 2010 when President Obama came forward with a $1 trillion package and we all about fell over. We're now up to almost $10 trillion. So, I think every economist has a different opinion. I have great respect for Mark Zandi, but I think you could find an economist who thinks differently, who thinks too much money is being flooded into the system.
Senator Shelley Moore Capito, we appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Judy.